Good morning to everyone. I'm glad to have you here today, especially our visitors. I know we always say that, but we do appreciate when visitors are here, especially when so many of our own folks are out of town or sick. So we really appreciate you being here today because I'm sure not all of you in the audience are up to feeling 100%, probably myself included, but we're happy you're here. There's a lot of sickness going around, so please be careful, take care of yourselves, and hopefully some of these folks we're missing will be back soon with us. This morning we're going to spend most of our time in Luke 16. If you want to turn over there, we're going to be in Luke 16 quite a bit. And in Luke 16 we find one of the lesser known parables. It's the one about the unrighteous steward. And this is an interesting parable. It's not very long, it's only like 12 verses. And in this parable, it's found in Luke right after the parable of the lost coin. And the parable right before that one was the one of the prodigal son. Now, both of those parables are probably a lot well known than the parable of the steward. But what's interesting to me is how so many of the parables, and these three included, are about money. The sower and the lost sheep are also probably more well-known parables of Jesus. And in a roundabout way, those are about money too, or wealth. Somebody owns a farm where you sow seed, and some rancher owns sheep if you have a lost sheep. So the reason Jesus used parables because it was easy to make the application. And that is something the people understood back then. Raising animals and farming. Now, a parable was a method of teaching that Jesus used many times in the scripture. There's some dispute. If you want to look it up and get on the Google and look it up, there's different numbers of how many parables there are in the New Testament. It's around 40, probably a little more than that, but there's a lot of them in there. And of course, just to clarify our terms, a parable is a simple story to illustrate a moral or spiritual lesson. So here we have the parable of the unrighteous steward. And let's look at Luke 16 at this story. The story, and we'll read it in a minute, but it illustrates and gives us some good lessons from bad example. And that's where this parable has a little bit of a twist to it. This fellow who was a steward of his master's wealth, we get good lessons from him and we get bad lessons from him. And we as Christians can learn many lessons from the world about money and our attitude toward it, both good and bad, and how this can affect us spiritually. If we live our life from the attitude of how can we spend more time making more money, or how to get most out of our money. So let's look at this story. It's in two parts. The first is the narrative part of the story that actually tells the story. And then the last 11, 12, 13, 4 or 5 verses tells the application. So let's read the first 8 verses of Luke 16. It says there, now he was also saying to the disciples, we have Jesus talking. He said, there was a certain rich man who had a steward, and this steward was reported to him as a squandering his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward. And the steward said to himself, what shall I do, since my master's taking my stewardship away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I'm going to stop there. And that's our story so far about the steward. Now, this bad steward, he had the job of overseeing his rich master's kingdom. and included collecting profits from his farming operations. That was his job. And this was not uncommon back then for a large landowner to have somebody under him who to manage the affairs, and there was probably another level of supervision under that to take care of the ranching and the groves and the orchards and whatever else they had to take care of. And we see this even in other parables, and this is something that I'd always wondered about, but it does make sense to me. If you remember the parable of the Great Supper, about the man who couldn't come because he had new land to see. He was invited to this great supper. I can't come. Now I've got land I got to go look at. And another one couldn't come because he had 5 yoke of oxen. I want to go try them out. I haven't tried them out yet. And I always wondered, who buys land without first going and looking at the land? And then you decide whether you're going to buy it or not. The same way with 5 yoke of oxen. Would you buy them sight unseen? I don't think so. So it would make sense that these men here would probably have had other people go and buy this land or buy this yoke of oxen. And then now it's that in their possession, they want to go check them out. That was their excuse for not going to the supper. Buying 5 yoke of oxen unseen would be like, I'm going to buy a new truck from somebody in Texas, but I'm not going to go check it out. And you fly over there to drive it back, it doesn't have an engine in it. Well, you should have made a little better preparation and had somebody check it out for you. So in this parable, the rich man had his steward who was in charge of collecting, or as we would say today, he was in charge of accounts receivable. He collected the money. And the master says, "What is this? I have a report," and evidently it was a good report, that says, "You have squandered my possessions." And right away, he fires him. Doesn't give him a chance to even say anything. "For you can no longer be steward." In verse 3 it says, "And the steward said to himself, 'What shall I do, since my master is taking the stewardship away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg.'" The master said, "You're fired, and I want you to give an accounting of your stewardship before you go and close the book." And this is when the steward had a light bulb go off over his head. In verse 3 where it says, "And the steward said to himself, 'What am I going to do? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg.'" Here's the case of a shrewd, problem-solving person. The steward identified and focused on his problem, and he thought, how in the world can I solve this? And what was his solution? He says, "I don't know. I can't dig. I'm a pencil pusher. I'm used to telling people what to do. I can't go out and dig all day. I'll be good for an hour maybe, but after that, forget it. I'm not that strong. I can't be a beggar. I'm kind of well known in the community as the steward of this master's kingdom. I can't be seen out by the gate or by the sidewalk begging. I'm just too proud for that." He says, "I know." The light bulb goes off. He was, after all, a smart and shrewd man. Now, shrewd, we've kind of given a negative connotation to shrewd. Shrewd means basically you have sharp powers of judgment. That's all shrewd means. That doesn't mean a bad thing. But he came up with a plan. He remembered his master's debtors. Look in verse 4. "I know what I shall do, so that when I am removed from the stewardship, they will receive me into their homes." And he summoned each of his master's debtors. Now it lists 2 here. There could very well have been more. I don't know. But we see the 2 that he went to in verse 5. And he went to each of his master's debtors and began saying to his first, how much do you owe my master? Remember, he's got to close out the book before he leaves. I don't know that this was the wisest choice for the master. If you fire somebody, you usually want to get them off the property, escorted by security. You don't want them in the company anymore. But he had to go close the books. He had to go get the money that was owed. How much do you owe my master? Verse 6, and he said, 100 measures of oil. He owed 100 measures of oil. The first one, this guy was probably something like what we would call a sharecropper. He didn't own his land, but he grew stuff on it for the master who owned it, and grew the crops and harvested them and processed them in whatever way, and then got part of the profit from that. And he owed 100 measures of oil. Now, a measure of oil, according to what I could find, is between 8 and 9 gallons. So he owed 800 or 900 gallons of oil. And this is probably olive oil that they used quite a bit back then. 900 gallons of oil, that's, if you want to do the math, I don't know, 14 or 15 55-gallon drums like we see laying around industrial places today. That's a lot of oil. And there's a lot of labor involved in getting that oil. You got to go out with, as I understand, they would use poles to shake the trees and knock the olives down, gather them up, and then they had to take them in and put them through a press and go through all this stuff. So it was a lot of labor. So this was a big thing that he owed. He owed 100 measures of oil. But what does the steward do? The steward arranges to cut his debt by half. He says, take your bill, sit down quickly and write 50. The steward's giving him the note and says, look, do with this what you will. Quickly, pay me 50 right now. The steward arranges to cut his debt in half. And there's a reason for that. He says, now how would you feel? Put yourself in the shoes of this man who owed 100 measures. Let's say you bought a new car, you traded in your old car, you had to get a $20,000 loan, and somebody from the dealership came over and said, quick, before the people at the car thing change their mind, you owe $20,000. Here, sign this, you'll owe 10. You've suddenly become $10,000 richer because you don't have to pay 20, you only paid 10. You've cut your debt in half. What would you say? You would say, well, you're my new best friend. Thank you very much. Hey, if I can ever do something for you, oh, I know, you could even stay at my house if you wanted to. In verse 7, he says, then he went to another one and he said, how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, well, take your bill and write 80. Quickly, do it. 100 measures of wheat. There's like 10 bushels in a measure or thereabouts. That's 1,000 bushels of wheat. That's a lot of wheat to have to harvest and take to the threshing floor and get to market. It's a lot of labor. But the steward tells him to just pay back 80. Well, what do you think this guy's attitude was toward that? Thank you very much. That's a fantastic deal. Oh, if you ever need a place to stay, come on over to my house. Now in verse 9 we see, in verse 8 he says, and his master praised the unrighteous steward because he had acted shrewdly. For the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. Now the master in verse 8, there's some question as if it's referring to the steward in the story or it's referring to Jesus himself. And the original Greek language kind of suggests it's Jesus being referred to. But in any case, it was the steward's astuteness. That's the word for today, astute. That means you arrange a situation to benefit yourself. It was his astuteness and not his morality that was being condemned. Morally, he was a bankrupt person because he did a bad job as a steward. But he's being commended for his shrewdness. Now, verse 9 and 10 makes an important part. It says there, "And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings." What does that mean? Verse 10 says, "He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much, and he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous also in much." So the applications here are kind of plural. There's more than one application. And the first one says to be like him, and the second one says don't be like him at all. So there's kind of the sounds like doublespeak or confusion in this parable. On the one part, be like the steward. On the other part, don't be like the steward. Be like him. Take mammon or money of unrighteousness and make friends, because when money fails, you can't take it with you. When talking about when money fails, when does money fail us? Whenever does money fail? If I could lay $50,000 on you right now, just think what we could do. But when does that money fail you? Once you're gone. Once you've left this earth, it doesn't go with you. It stays here for somebody else to fight over. You've done your work on this earth and you've gone on to your reward. That mammon of unrighteousness, it tells us, try to make friends with that money because you can't take it with you when you go. When you use your money to win people for Christ, and that's kind of the lesson here, use your money to win people for Christ. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of that unrighteous mammon. When you make these friends, they will welcome you into their heavenly home when you're dead. Make friends for yourselves by means of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. Use your money wisely towards spiritual growth, and you will receive spiritual reward. So how do we use our money for spiritual growth? Well, first and foremost for most of us here, we support our local church, our local work. 1 Corinthians 16:2 says, on the first day of each week, we should put aside a portion of the money you have earned as you have prospered, that no collections be made when I come. And in 2 Corinthians 9:7, it says, each one give as he has decided in his heart, not begrudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. So the commandment is we give every first day of the week, and not just when we show up at services. And we're supposed to give as we've been prospered. And that works both ways. If you haven't prospered anything that week, and that's possible, you're under no obligation if you don't have it. But if you have prospered, you're to lay by and store every first day of the week, even if you're not here. And I'm sure none of us in this congregation have the attitude that, man, I missed last Sunday, didn't have to give my money. That's too bad for them. I'll just pick it up next week. When we're supposed to lay by and store every first day of the week. Which means, if you go on vacation and you miss 2 Sundays, you don't just bypass giving on that Sunday. You make it up, or you leave it here with someone to give. Every first day of the week, not just when we're here. We give of our means, whatever those means are, whether it's much or not so much. How about supporting a preacher, doing missionary work? You can do that on your own. This congregation has done that in the past and supported men. But there's nothing stopping us from doing that individually if you know of a need. And that's what brings us to our reading this morning in Philippians 4, where Paul writes about just that. And that was our scripture reading. And over in Philippians 4, he said in verse 15, and you yourselves also know, Philippians, that at the first preaching of the gospel, after I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, but you did alone. For even in Thessalonica, you sent a gift more than once for my needs. Now, Paul wasn't asking or begging for money. And he did have a job. He had a career. He's a tent maker. But he's pretty busy and wasn't always the most healthy person. So there are times he needed support. And verse 17, he said, not that I seek the gift itself, but I seek for the profit. And listen to this, which increases to your account. So your giving of that unrighteous mammon has benefited you spiritually in your spiritual account. Another money reference. How about be generous with people you come in contact with? That's something we can do. Offer to buy someone a meal once in a while, or help them out if they need help. Now in the second application, look at verse 10. It says there, he who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. And he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous in much. Basically, you are what you are, whether you have a lot or you have little. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. You can be a skinflint miser and be poor and not give anything to anybody ever, or you can be super wealthy and be a skinflint and keep your money and not give anything to anybody then too. And both ways, you're in the wrong. Just the opposite of that is true. You could not have anything but be a very giving person. And maybe not just money, but in time or support. It's your heart that is important, not whether you're rich or poor. It is your service to God that is important. It's your obedience that is important, whether you have little or whether you have much. So again, here's the lessons of the story. The way that a person acts as a steward of little shows how they will act as a steward of much. And we are stewards of the kingdom. And whether we have little or whether we have much, we can be a good steward or we can be a bad steward. If someone cannot use proper care over a trust given to them for which they're going to be called into account, he will not be given wealth of his own to use as he pleases. In other words, we reap what we sow. And in verse 13, it says we cannot serve two masters. No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the one, or else he will hold to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Now, these are not two masters who have the same philosophies or the same thought process or the same requirements or expectations. I guess that's possible. If you could have two people that are vibing on the same wavelength and the expectations are the same, but that's not what they're talking about here. They're not making the different demands on the slave, okay, if they're on the same wavelength. These masters are on the one hand worldliness and on the other hand godliness. And they are so diametrically opposed to each other, they don't even face one another. One's over here facing that way, and one's over here facing that way. Worldliness on one hand, godliness on the other. And in this point, it's not the nature of the slave that is most important, but as I heard a preacher say one day, or heard when he did a lesson, it is the nature of the master that is important. It's the nature of the master. Look at it this way when it comes to the difference in the two masters. On the money side, on the worldly side, get more. Get more any way you can. If you have to cheat, if you have to lie, get more. Now, what's God tell us? Give. And give more cheerfully. Be generous with your time and your money and your love. On the other hand, world says, look out for number one. Think of yourself first. That's the most important thing. God says, love your neighbor as yourself. And as best you can, get along with everybody. Now, that's in Romans 12:18. The world says it's okay to white lie a little, bend the truth, lie a little bit to your advantage, twist the facts just a little bit, if you can make something out of it. What's God tell us to do? Speak the truth. Put away all falsehood. That's in Ephesians 4:25. So one more time. The lessons of this parable. And I'm going to say them again because repetition is effective. You've heard me say that before. Repetition is effective. I heard that from Paul Harvey. Number one, use your money to win friends for Christ. Number two, be careful in handling your money, whether you have a lot of it or whether you have just a little bit. And you can't be a servant to two masters. That's just not going to work. One of them is going to win out over the other. So the best thing that we can do is make Christ our master and be obedient to him. This was not one lesson to tell of how to let Christ become your master, but that opportunity is open to any here who feel the need to be baptized today and take that step. Or if you feel you need the supporting prayers of the congregation or have sinned in some public way, we can take care of that too at this time. And that opportunity is open as we stand and sing.